Thank you so much. If you're standing in the back, there are still some chairs out in the hallway. You're welcome to bring them in. Sorry, this is a really weird, long, kind of awkward room for the presentation, but I'm so pleased to welcome all of you here today. We're going to be discussing a little bit about the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium and our work over the past year, as well as then opening up the session to our plenary note speakers from the M&E Peacebuilding Solutions Forum. We thought this was a wonderful opportunity to share with you some of the knowledge from the field, lessons from the field, and give you a bit more of that hands-on experience that the work of the PEC is helping to enable. So who here has heard of the PEC before, just by a raise of hands? Okay, so we're totally a biased audience. I love it. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about the PEC, but the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium is a field-wide effort that's aimed at addressing the unique challenges of measuring results and learning from peacebuilding programs. I should have that memorized. I'm sorry that I don't. This is like day 4, no, day 3. 10, 100, I don't know, of the conference. Today, the consortium is led by the Alliance for Peacebuilding and is joined by CDA Collaborative Learning, who's welcoming here Isabella Jean, Search for Common Ground, who I'm joined with Jack Farrell, and then Mercy Corps, who I'm joined with, oh, you got it to work, Carrie O'Neill. We also couldn't do this work without the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who has wonderfully financed and supported us in this endeavor to help change the culture of the peacebuilding monitoring and evaluation field. So today, thinking about a little bit our goal and the effort and the work that we've been doing, I can tell you that the PEC fosters field-wide change. Wow, I don't know who Amy Lusk is, but we're not joined by anyone on Skype. Is focused on changing field-wide change with 3 strategic reinforcing initiatives. The first is on developing methodological rigor, the second on improving the culture of evaluation, and something very important to myself and of course Jack, shared learning, and everyone else as well. And finally, on promoting evidence-based practice and policy. Just as a reminder, there are a few more chairs outside. Sorry we didn't haul them in. You're welcome to bring them in if you'd like, or welcome to stand. I think it's very hot in here myself. So I'm going to give you just a really brief introduction to how Alliance for Peacebuilding has been working towards these strategically enforcing initiatives in the last year, and then I'm going to hand it off to my 3 collaborators and colleagues before we enter into a little bit more of our plenary presentations. So just to give you a little bit of understanding of the efforts that we've been undertaking as part of the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium, Alliance for Peacebuilding is very focused on whole-of-field learning as well as macro and systems level research that can support the individual initiatives of not only our peacebuilding members but the field as a whole, as well as looking at how we can better partner with researchers and academics to achieve greater understanding and evidence to support the cause of peace. Some of the things that we've been undertaking has been conducting a subsector review on violence reduction that's actually looking at how we can better understand the evidence base within violence reduction programming to support the work that we're doing. Who's doing what, when, where, and why, and what the impact has been. That report's going to be coming out. It's a macro level analysis looking at theories of change. We're going to be sharing that in probably the next couple months. I know my colleague Isabella will be talking about a subsector review that CDA has been undertaking in the same vein. Additionally, we've been conducting research with leading academics as part of the empirical studies of conflict. Some of you who were in one of our presentations yesterday probably saw some of the preliminary findings of that research, but we're looking at how we can better fill in the 3IE impact evaluation evidence gap map. I think that Mike Finley, one of my colleagues from the University of Texas, Austin, stated very succinctly that every piece of evidence on 3IE's evidence gap map comes from one evaluation, which is not ideal. There's been a lot of other great work that people in this room, as well as some of my colleagues, have been undertaking to better understand that. Additionally, we have been working on, I'm very excited to say, an indicator database, trying to look at the key forms of measurement peacebuilding programs are using to further the case for more quantitative measures within peacebuilding. It is not an assessment of the quality of these indicators, but we feel that we have to start first from a place of knowledge. How is everyone trying to measure something as intangible and difficult as trust or social cohesion or resiliency, so that we can then take a next step to start testing some of those indicators and better understanding the standardized and aggregate norms that we're using to talk about peace building and concepts we perceive to be success of our projects. The other major part that I think many in the room have probably heard about is the publication of the guiding steps for peacebuilding design, monitoring, evaluation. AFP in our pursuit under this initiative is really looking at the foundational basics of what we want every peacebuilding program doing to help further the case for monitoring and evaluation in the field. This is not a how-to guide, but rather a what to do, and we're looking to produce some accompanying guidance that would help discuss some of the greater nuance. One of the steps involves conducting a baseline, but we all know, I hope, that there are multiple ways potentially to conduct a baseline. It's not a set, rigorous approach that's one way. So how do we get us all moving towards at least a standardized norm of the basics, so then we can start getting more contextual and I think creative in our approaches to measurement. And then the final aspect, and I'll hand it over, and I know I'm talking really fast, I'm sorry about that, it's been a busy day, relates to our Peacebuilding M&E Solutions Forum, which I see quite a few familiar faces in the audience who participated. Our first kind of inaugural event came about Tuesday, which was only 2 days ago, where we welcomed 40 presenters from actually 11 countries from around the world. We had over 100 participants, again from around the world, who were focused on sharing both processes and methodologies for how we actually conduct this work. As I said, we want to talk about baselines, we want to talk about data quality assurances, perhaps impact evaluations, or rigorous qualitative studies. It's great to talk about, but how are you actually doing it? What lessons did you learn? What problems did you encounter? And then how did you make adjustments in order to follow that method? So that was our inaugural event, and I'm hoping that in the future we'll be able to look forward to doing more, both here at home as well as abroad. And as I said, we are joined by our plenary speakers who are going to give you a little bit of flavor of what went on during that event and share some key lessons and takeaways we think will be important to you within this program. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Isabella.
Thank you. Should I stand up because I can't see all of you? Okay,
Yeah,
hopefully that's helpful. Strange room. Thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to see a lot of interest. Just like last year in the PEC panel, we had standing room only, I think. Just quickly, since we only each have 5 minutes, I'll highlight a couple of things that CDA has been focusing on. And as Jessica mentioned, we do think of this pieces of work falling under distinct pillars, but also being interrelated. So on the methodological rigor, we have used the guiding steps that you just heard about to inform the development of a pilot training, which we just recently piloted about a month ago here in Washington with a range of participants from operational organizations that are implementing peacebuilding programs across the world, as well as UN PBSO and State Department and colleagues from academia and private foundations and a number of other organizations. And it was an interesting opportunity to bring these modules, these pilot modules out to be tested and to collect real-time feedback. As we were teaching them, we were also pausing and collecting feedback from participants because quite a few of the modules, which are structured loosely around the guiding steps sequence, are assuming some level of prior knowledge of conflict analysis, of foundational peace-building principles. And yet even those are not always shared equally across organizations working on this. So it was really important for us to hear what people wanted to hear more on or to practice more on and what they wanted less on. The modules will be stackable, it's a modular training by definition, and once it is revised based on the feedback that we just received, it'll be uploaded on the M&E for Peace, which you'll be hearing all about from Jack in a few minutes, and it'll be open source resource, which PEC has committed to put out for others to download and use as you need, and it will remain modular in a sense that you will be able to choose which pieces are more important for your team, for the people you're working with or advising. So I think that's all I'll say on that. But maybe just before I move on, just an indication of what sorts of modules are in there. We have a strong interest, I think, across the PEC in emerging practices around adaptive management, around how to monitor and evaluate for conflict sensitivity, and other pieces that are not covered in other M&E trainings out there, including in the online Peacebuilding Evaluation Guide that PEC has produced, and it's already been used by many of you, and also sits on the M&E for Peace. So we have introduced some most recent thinking drawn from examples from PEC members, as well as from all of our advisory work that CDA does with partners around the globe who are testing different adaptive management approaches to their peacebuilding programming. So you'll see some of those in the modules as well. And the other piece, as Jessica mentioned, to contribute to that improved evidence base on what works and what doesn't, we have been working on a subsector review. Thanks to many of you who were here last year, we put out an open call for evaluations of reconciliation programming here at this conference last October. And we received 36 evaluations eventually, and boosted some of those with additional evaluations that were shared with us fairly recently. But the fact that a lot of organizations were able to share their evaluations, some of them anonymous, confidentially, and asking for anonymity in the report was an important step. It makes the task of summarizing and doing this subsector review a little challenging when we have to ensure anonymity. But it's been an interesting example of collaboration across the sector, where we have the evaluations. They are of different quality. They are representing very diverse type of programming, and yet there are some really interesting things to say about the application of theories of change. And our biggest interest, of course, in this review is at the outcome level findings, at the results that are being reported at the outcome level. So that report will also be uploaded on the M&E for Peace this fall, and we hope that many more such reviews will be done by others, or in the future by Alliance for Peacebuilding and other PEC members, because it's an important contribution to the evidence base. I think I reached the time? Okay, great, thanks.
Perfect, thank you, Isabella. Quick pre-test of the room. How many people here have heard of DME for Peace? Now, this is an easy audience. For those of you who are unfamiliar, DME for Peace is an online learning platform, a clearinghouse for evaluations, reports, and results for a better understanding of what works, what doesn't, and why, in not only the peacebuilding field, but the development and humanitarian fields. So DME for Peace was founded about 7 years ago, and the goal was really to provide resources for local practitioners so that they could understand how to better design, monitor, and evaluate their programs. Since then, we've transitioned to become a more proactive learning platform. How are we doing that? We're not just acting as a clearinghouse for evaluations and reports. We're proactively trying to share emerging research, as well as make sure that practitioners around the world have access to resources that they don't normally have. So right now we have over 1,000 community uploaded resources on the site. We have around 6,000 subscribers. And we've hosted over 100 Thursday Talk webinars to date. Over the last year, these webinars have had an average attendance around 98 attendees. And that's a live discussion on a Thursday morning where practitioners, no matter where they are in the world, can host a discussion, showcase their research, as well as solicit input from the wider community. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 points today in my very brief 5 minutes. The goal of the platform is to make learning accessible. One of the #1 complaints I get from program staff that are accessing resource on DME for Peace is that, yes, they understand the importance of evaluation, but they don't actually know how to put it into practice. How do we move beyond the jargon of outcome harvesting and log frames and actually break evaluation down into its fundamental parts? What we're trying to do is give program staff the tools to understand what works, what doesn't, and why. So I'm going to implore all the evaluators in the room to cut the jargon. The second thing I want to talk about is our traditional perception of the online community of practice model doesn't work. And this might sound weird for someone whose platform is funded as a community of practice and develops community of practice for donors, but the collaboration and communication that these communities of practice were meant to establish are often inorganic. And we've found that communities of practice require a lot of work and a lot of provocation to actually make a difference. That's why I'm moving on to my third point. We've shifted our focus towards direct peer-to-peer connections. So over the last 4 years, with support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, DME for Peace has been developing a mentorship program. It took us a couple of years to get it right. We had 200 applicants in the first few years, and really what we tried to do was create this open-ended program. Over the last couple of years, we decided to strip it down and break it down to what our community was actually looking for, and that is the foundations of monitoring and evaluation. So last year, we ran the program. We had over 300 participants, or 300 applicants from 70 countries around the globe. They went through an 8-week process going through the foundations of monitoring and evaluation. Everything from what is design, what is evaluation, what is a smart indicator, and really just tried to break down the core concepts in M&E. What we found was that 100% of participants said they learned something new that was directly applicable to their work. So most recently, through the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium again, we just closed applications for this program a couple of weeks ago. We had nearly 500 applications from 77 countries around the globe, and those participating in the program actually just kicked off their What is Evaluation topic last week. So I'm going to use this final moment to make a call for greater collaboration and cooperation in our field. How many of you in the room publish your evaluations online? That's not nearly enough. So what I want to say is no organization has that special serum that makes your program better than another organization's. But what your reports, what your evaluations, what your research has is the potential to improve the work of others who can build upon that. Use platforms like DME for Peace. Use platforms like Eval Partners. Upload your research, upload your evaluations. Host a Thursday talk. Let the community know let the community develop on the knowledge which you build. If anyone's interested in hosting a Thursday talk or has any questions about the community platform, please feel free to ask me any questions.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Carrie O'Neill, and I'm with Mercy Corps. We're hearing from two of my colleagues in a moment about some of the real learning that's happening at the organization, so I'll keep this really brief. As an implementing organization that's part of the PEC, we're really looking at how do we strengthen DM&E practices within our agency, how do we really help support our teams to do this better, and how do we also be more transparent and collaborative about what our challenges are and how we're working to fix them related to thinking about how to measure our peace-building programs. So a couple of the initiatives that we're working on include doing an agency-wide look at programs that have governance and peace-building components and really looking at how are we doing, and then doing a deep dive on telling the story of our DM&E processes and then also adaptive management for a set of programs in Lebanon that have peace-building and governance components, really looking at being honest about what our challenges are, what our wins are, and trying to do exactly what Jack is kind of beseeching us to do, which is to be more transparent about and real about what we're trying to do in terms of making social change. A second set of deliverables has to do with trying to increase collaboration and coordination between agencies in a country context. So in Myanmar, we're working with Search and a number of other local organizations and other international NGOs to mount a number of activities related to trying to help people understand what we're learning as it relates to different subsectors, social cohesion, intercommunal intercommunal cooperation, et cetera. And then how do we set up a set of capacity development opportunities not only for international organizations but also our local partners to really try to raise the tide, so to speak, as it relates to these skills in a country context. And then finally, we're also looking at sharing out lessons from an RCT that we've done in a conflict management context in Nigeria, and really looking at what are the pros and cons of doing an RCT in a peace-building context, and how do we bring those learnings to the broader community.
Thank you so much to my colleagues at the PEC. So I'm going to hand this over then to our plenary speakers. First, we'll be learning a little bit more about how do we improve research design both before, during, and after implementation. That'll be led by Keith Ives, the CEO and co-founder of Causal Design, and John Kurtz, the Director of Research and Learning at Mercy Corps. Then we'll be following that up with a conversation related to improving data analytics and understanding analysis, particularly of composite indices, with the Director of Research, Dr. David Hammond at the Institute of Economics and Peace. And finally, we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about how do we make evidence and data not only used, but also useful to a variety of contexts. That'll be brought to us by Dr. Andy Bloom, who's the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice Studies at the University of San Diego, and Beza Tesfaye, a Senior Researcher at Mercy Corps. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect. I'm John. That's Keith. And we're excited today to share some experiences that we have on conducting impact evaluations. I'm going to mess this up again. And on conflict. And we're going to structure it largely around the program cycle. So one caveat up front on behalf of the whole panel. For those of you who were at this presentation 2 days ago, we haven't updated our thinking evidence experience in those 2 days, so bear with us. Hopefully your questions will be updated though. So Keith and I have done a lot of collaboration, and our organizations have, on this topic. And I think the defining feature has been that it's been in places that are quite tricky: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Northeast Nigeria. And on topics that are very difficult to get at rigorously. So we've had, by necessity, to be quite creative and innovative around how do you do impact evaluation that answers causal questions well, given those limitations. And I think we've pulled off some success where maybe we shouldn't have tried. And as a result, we decided that this would be our poster for the session. Because we do feel like there's a need for this community to push ourselves harder, where appropriate, to really think about methods that might go beyond some of the traditional approaches we've taken as a peace and conflict field historically. And the alternative one, who I just saw peek in the window, would have been Sharon Morris here, who's made this point for years. So I think with that, Keith was going to give just a little bit of background on, why is this a need? When does this apply? Where does it apply?
Yeah, and I think that's right. Before we jump into these case studies, talking a little bit about the why, and the biggest one is that we're getting more and more pressure to show our work, to demonstrate the impact of these interventions, and both externally from our donors and from governments, but also internally from our own program teams and the clients that I work with who are saying, we want to know that this works. We want to know how to do it better. We want to know how to do it more efficiently. I think some of you are going to be able to see this. Historically, most of our impact evaluations, and I'm generally talking about kind of your RCTs here, those big quantitative, rigorous studies, have been on the right side of this matrix. And these, it might be a big unanswered question, a theoretical question about what works, but we're doing it in relatively stable contexts. And we need that type of research in the peace building community. We need more of these big theoretical investigations. But more and more, I think we also have space and we have an imperative to do this on the left side of this matrix as well, where we're testing maybe more of the outputs or on a shorter time frame, doing more just program testing on how we improve these interventions on the margin.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to structure this by preempting all of the issues that you have with what Keith just said. And I'll use the mic so you can hear me. The first one that we always get when we bring in impact evaluation, especially at an upfront stage, negotiating with program teams in the field, we think this is a really good learning opportunity. How about we try to attach some rigorous evaluation to this? Oh, come on, that's going to take so long to get results. We have a demand to be able to have understanding of if our program is working, during the course of the program, not 2 years later. So, Keith, how do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, first, it's that your learning agenda shouldn't start or end with your impact evaluation report. That's not where the learning happens. The learning happens far before, and it's where we go in and we explore. We do exploratory research, potentially with administrative data.
We did a study looking at the Afrobarometer data, looking at the correlates with youth propensity for violence across sub-Saharan Africa. And that was absent of any program. But then we used that to build a theory that could inform Mercy Corps' programs around conflict in another country or context. And that kind of goes to the next step in this learning agenda that happens long before the impact evaluation. And that's where we leverage that baseline data. Every single one of your programs probably has baseline data. And that theory that you built your program on, you can now be doing kind of plausibility testing in your context. Did that knowledge actually, does it apply? Does it map out to the same, in the case of Somalia, which we'll be talking about later, theory where civic engagement has some relationship with propensity for violence?
Perfect. The next one, assuming we've made it past that first hurdle, is, okay, great. We can learn from some of this cross-sectional data, but I'm assuming in order to really understand impact, you're going to tell me we need to withhold this program from certain people. Not only is that impractical, but it may be unethical given that we're trying to reduce tensions, not increase them here through our programming.
Right. John, you're right. That's when we get in the field, that's almost the first question we get. Well, we can't have a control group. It's not ethical. And I'd say there's almost always some natural constraint to your program. I've yet to go into the ground and start talking with an implementing team, and they go, yeah, we've got the money to work with everybody in country. Every single household. So what we look for, what are some natural constraints, budgetary, geographic, operational, logistical, that we can leverage to create a compelling and viable counterfactual. In Afghanistan, we worked, John, with your team on the INVEST vocational training program, where they were investing in vocational training for youth, thinking that would improve kind of economic outcomes, employability, and hopefully exploring how that related to propensity for violence. Well, they could only put so many students in seats at a time. And so we oversubscribed a wait list, and we randomized the first cohort into the classroom. They were our treatment group. And that second cohort that eventually got the program the following year was our control group until they entered the program. Oh, this is me, yeah. So we get in country, we help create this specification, this identification strategy. We get the perfect impact evaluation. And the next thing I hear from the team, though, is like, yeah, but this is way too constraining. We need to be adaptive. We need to be able to change our program on the fly and make sure that we're maximizing the outcomes we're targeting.
Yeah, and this is a very real thing. I mean, I actually remember, I think it was the PEC, did a case study of an RCT that Mercy Corps led and worked with IPA on in Liberia, where it did tie the program down in ways that were detrimental to success. So that's out there and it's real. At the same time, I think we have some pretty strong techniques now to be able to say, look, let's take some of these ideas and methods and apply them in ways that actually can be timely and work towards helping us adapt programming. So one example is what we're doing in Northeast Nigeria at the moment. During an inception phase of a program there, we're doing a survey with an experiment embedded in it with different types of messages that are essentially trying to test the efficacy of messages to support reintegration of former Boko Haram fighters. So that's something that's up front. Results will be then baked into the media campaign for that program. So it's feeding adaptation versus kind of constraining it. And the other side of this is really thinking about how we set up M&E in ways that are conducive to learning, not just about operations, but about interim outcomes. And one way that we've done this, and I heard a good example from CRS colleagues the other day, was, just thinking about program exposure. A number of months you've been involved in the program, a number of training sessions a given participant has been exposed to, and trying to, again, sort of leverage that to say, there's more or less of the program equate with more or greater outcomes. So those are really good sort of relative counterfactuals that M&E can be set up around to help us learn something along the way. And then there's this. Okay, let's just assume that you've bought things so far, but with conflict issues in particular, especially some of the more sensitive political contexts where we're working, it is very difficult to measure these things in ways that we can trust and that we feel are reliable when you're asking people about support for violent actions, engagement in risky behaviors, these types of things. So what do you do with that?
Yeah. Well, that's not unique to peacebuilding, but it's definitely worse. It's exacerbated because we have all of these social desirability biases built into the questions that we're asking. Hey, do you support Boko Haram? It's not an easy question, and you're likely to have that challenge. Well, first thing is that everybody lies, and that should be reassuring. Okay, so what we're doing when we're analyzing the data is we're actually rarely looking for point estimates, meaning I don't care exactly how much John makes per year in his salary. What I care is that when I ask him this year, and then I come back a year from now, I care about the delta, the change that's occurred in between those two periods. Fortunately, everyone lies. Fortunately, they're kind of consistent about it. And so if you exaggerate your response by 3% this year, you're most likely going to exaggerate it by 3% next year. And we can still understand the impact or the change in that community or that outcome of interest, regardless of the bias that's in it. The other thing that's really exciting, and we've been playing with Mercy Corps and a couple of contexts, is using indirect questioning or using methods of asking the question that allows the respondent to hide their response and to feel that they have some anonymity. And these are survey experiments or experimental games within the surveys, like list experiments or random response. And we can talk to you more about the details of that after the presentation. That takes us all the way through, and now we're at the end. And John, there's been so many times that we've gotten into a study, into a program, or even at the end of the program, and then decided, hey, we really want to see what we can learn here, but we forgot to design it beforehand. Or we designed a perfect study, and things kind of went sideways, and maybe it wasn't ideal at the end.
Yeah, we've got more than our share of experience with that. And a couple of things that we've done are essentially in the space of quasi-experimental design. So these are sort of the next of kin to an RCT, and they look something like this. So for example, in a precursor to the study in Afghanistan that Keith was mentioning, we wanted to answer that same question, but we weren't proactive enough to kind of build in the research design he described. So in Hellman, we simply compared an outgoing cohort of youth with an incoming cohort of youth and used propensity score matching to kind of tease out real differences that were related to the outcomes versus pre-existing kind of like endowments. So that was one example. Andy and Beza will talk about a program in Somalia where we were similarly after the fact wanting to learn more, and we use a different kind of a matching technique. So those are some good ones that we've been able to do, recognizing they're limited, recognizing you can't really get at causality that way. So we're not aiming for top tier journals with them, but we certainly are able to learn more than we would have otherwise if we've said, well, we simply can't do that.
So then there's this other tricky problem. John, what does Mercy Corps do? What has your experience been? When we get to the end of the study, and I've authored some of these reports, we get to the very end, and I have to come and knock on the door and say, hey, John, we've run the numbers, and we really didn't find an impact. How are you managing that?
Yeah, first, I'd like to say that we have created kind of a organizational environment where we're ready for that. It's probably not quite true. It varies, but I think that's the starting point of just saying, look, we need to be more comfortable with the fact that that's likely to be the case more often than not. That said, we do try to use some techniques to be able to take out some of that anxiety and make sure that this even sort of null results get used. One is trying to make the research more about the program theory than the sort of program results themselves. So given the Afghanistan example, they designed that to change economic outcomes amongst youth. Given where it was and who the program was working with in Kandahar, there was an implicit theory around that then leading to greater stability in the region. But when we didn't find that in the Hellman example, it wasn't so much heat on that program to say we didn't change something that we had said we would. So that kind of helps to shift a little bit of the focus. The other thing that I think is a little bit more of an ambition to do is to be more on the front end of these and work through with teams to say, look, there are multiple different kind of scenarios and outcomes that we might have. Some will be positive, negative, some will be null. How would you respond to each of those so that there's sort of at least eyes wide open going in and not kind of surprised at the end?
Yeah. That was our deck, a bit in fast forward. So I just want to recap on kind of the takeaways. One, in the same way that the peacebuilding field and your strategies and your approaches are constantly evolving. and you're trying to innovate and trying to figure out what works. On the evaluation side and the methodology side, we are too. And so don't operate under the assumption that because somebody said it wasn't possible a couple of years ago, that it's not possible methodologically to do it today. And don't approach these with the position or the mentality of, this is too complex for an impact evaluation. Approach it with the mentality of how do we innovate in the methods to make an impact evaluation feasible and a viable counterfactual, reliable in this context. Sometimes that's going to get tricky, and so this is where I step in with a shameless self-promotion. Hey, call an economist. Don't rely on your internal folks. Call somebody on the outside and see, run it by them. Get us in country to look and to partner with your team to help define those questions and say what is realistic and what learning agenda we can collaborate on.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks. Well, it's the second time I'm going to say thanks for hosting me, but thanks for hosting me. For those of you who haven't heard me, thank you for hosting me before. Then thank you for hosting me and listening to me and coming to see my talk. So I work for the Institute for Economics and Peace. So in terms of M&E, we actually do on-the-ground programming, and we do have experience with M&E. But what I was going to talk about today is actually zooming out a little bit and having a look at some of the more global issues surrounding analyzing data and thinking about data and some of the issues that you get, which are going to be really pertinent to SDGs going forward. I think my background is I've done a lot of things. I was a security analyst for defense in Australia for a long time. My initial training was a mathematician. I've done international law and human rights and blah, 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 blah. So I sort of really appreciate my background because I've had a good mix of qualitative and quantitative, experience. And in doing so, I can see the real gaps between those two communities. So a lot of the things that I put into this presentation is really talking about that gap. And trying to get the qualitative people, or the people who aren't numbers people, for lack of a better phrase, to be more engaged with the numbers and have confidence in being able to question them and not taking them as given fact, because for a number of reasons, in fact, many of the reasons that you mentioned before, you can't do that. And it really needs a non-technical audience to be empowered to be able to do that. So what I'm going to do is just go through some of the issues that you can, if you want to be annoying to anyone who's done a quantitative study, just put your hand up, ask one of these questions, and let's keep the conversation going. The good examples of why this is important, if you have a look at Darfur in 2004, the estimates for number of people who died in that crisis, they range from 500,000 down to 10,000. So really wide-ranging estimates. If you have a look at Rwandan refugees going into Zaire in 1996, the estimates rated from 800,000 to it's not happening at all. And similarly for Kosovo, I think the range is 250,000 to this isn't a problem. So because these things are inherently political, and because that in the data revolution, and now that data is used for everything and has this prominence as a stable base to make decisions, then you can have this effect where the data people have this sort of inordinate power over the non-data people, because there isn't the ability to question them is limited. And I think it's really important because in those cases, all those ranges of numbers were used to justify response or non-response. And that's a problem. One, because if you don't have a decent number, you don't know how to make an appropriate response or non-response. But also going forward, you actually set up precedents based on data that could be flawed or could be politically motivated. So it's just important to keep that in mind. And one of the things, and this is more my personal view rather than me speaking as the Director of Research at the Institute for Economics and Peace, is because of all these issues, and we see them a lot, I'm sort of throwing it out there and asking for a code of ethics to be written for quantitative people, because there is this now responsibility for the data community to understand the implications of what they're doing, more so perhaps than before. So I just throw it out there. The Institute for Economics and Peace, I'm based in Sydney. We have 4 offices. We do a whole lot of research reports that we launch every year. The thing I'll probably be focusing on today is the SDG stuff, but we also do a lot of stuff in Mexico. We release a Global Peace Index every year. The Positive Peace Report gets launched in a couple of weeks. That got some attention yesterday in the last session, and the Global Terrorism Index will be launched in December. And we also work with the UN and the World Bank on, a lot of pathways for peace studies, a lot of fragility studies, and the SDGs. So the SDGs, we all know they stand for Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 16 is about peace and justice. It's the one that we do a lot of work in. There are 22 indicators. 8 of the 22 indicators have data for less than 50% of the countries. So 50% of the countries just doesn't have data. Only 7 of the indicators have data for more than 90% of the countries. So you really only have 7 indicators that are even possible to compare. 7 are tier 3, which means there is no agreed methodology for measuring these things. And some of the most important indicators, especially around violence and violence against women and violence against children, the indicators are comparable for less than 40% of the countries. So the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, could also stand for significant data gaps, and 100% of the SDGs will have these challenges. So let's have a look at what they are and how they impact things. Data gaps. Obviously, there's a paucity of this sort of high-level data, and the ability for countries to collect them is actually quite limited in many parts of the world. So agencies, in order to do global analysis, often use statistical imputation techniques to fill in data gaps. And there's a sort of responsible way of doing that, and a transparent way of doing that, and there's a less responsible and less transparent way of doing that. In my mind, and this is my own opinion, the more responsible way of doing it is keeping the imputation simple, so just using a regional average or something very simple. The reason I think that's a better approach is because either way you're going to be wrong, so at least let the community criticize you and you own the criticism, rather than have some statistical technique that bamboozles everyone and you sidestep their responsibility. So that's just my personal opinion, but I think it's important, and again, this is where the communication between technical and non-technical people needs to happen, that that gets asked. How have you filled in data gaps? Cross-program and cross-country data. Definitions, despite being pretty universal, the SDGs, the definitions and how countries record those SDGs are completely different. This is particularly stark in Europe. We were trying to do a pan-European study. You can't compare homicide rates across the countries in Europe because of different reporting structures, different units of analysis. So if you can't do it across Europe, then I don't know what you do for the rest of the world. How specific is context specific? So I think there's a lot of work, and this is particularly relevant for the M&E sphere. There's a lot of really good work that gets done on impact evaluation and lessons learned and all the rest of it. And as I said, we do a little bit of that, but there are people with better expertise than me in the room. So I'll defer to them. But I guess the question is, how do you then marry that really micro data with more macro level data? And there's a little bit of research in there that's going on. But the reason that's important is because if you have some really strong lessons learned, or you have a really good program that worked really well in one particular region, that's not to guarantee that that program's going to work anywhere else. And the ability to identify other areas where that would work, in some parts lies in understanding the greater context of a region. So if two regions are kind of similar, then a program that worked in one may work in another. If they're completely different, then you can't really say that. So there is some work that needs to be done to marry the sort of more global, more national level data to more micro level data in order to get the best value out of both of them. What to do when data contradicts reality? Again, I sort of mentioned this on Monday. This begs the question, what is reality? And if we knew what reality is, why would we bother measuring it? And if we are measuring reality and we know what it is and we know the data contradicts it, then how do we know that? But I think there's two things. This happens all the time. You see some data and it doesn't really make much sense. There are two things not to do. One of them is just blindly accept it because of all the other reasons that have been mentioned before. Another thing is not to just blindly reject it, which happens actually very regularly. The point of measuring this stuff is to really challenge assumptions, but what generally happens is if the data doesn't fit some person's perception of it, it gets thrown out. And that's one, potentially a massive waste of resources that took to generate the data in the first place. And two, kind of, shoots holes in the whole point of this whole thing. So the next slide, I've got a couple of resources that give you really good, strong checklists to go through and evaluate the strength of any one particular data set if this ever happens. And creating and interpreting multidimensional metrics. So IEP makes a lot of composite indices. There are many composite indices out there. If you actually look at them, the lists are all very similar. But the thing that I would again mention is certainly for the non-technical people, do not take composite indices as ground truth. Because what you're doing is you're taking a lot of information. So in our case, the Global Peace Index has 23 indicators. We take a lot of information and we combine it into one list, one number. And in doing that, so there's no way you can do that without losing a lot of information. My personal view is the value of that is it actually allows non-technical people to interact with the data and question and critique and really tease out some issues around how you make decisions around these things. So again, my preference is that any composite index is as basic as possible to allow for those discussions to happen. There are many very complicated methodologies out there, which may be statistically more attractive, but the point is the interaction. So I would caution if you can't, if you're reading a methodology and it doesn't immediately make sense to you, I would caution whether you use that data in the first place. Here's a couple of resources. This thing's great. I love this thing. The 5-step fact check. You can just have a look at the PDF. But it gives a really nice visual way of just being able to check the validity of data. So that if you do use or reject a certain data set, you at least have a process by which to justify your decision on. And the second one is the Handbook on Constructing Composite Indices, which is not interesting, but it's a really good go-to. It's the go-to resource for standards for data imputation and filling in data gaps, how to make a composite indice, and certain other types of analysis that it just gives you the guidelines, the baseline that you should be able to tick off when assessing data. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Beyza Tesfaye and I'm a senior researcher on the research and learning team, also at Mercy Corps. You heard a bit about the research challenges we face in designing rigorous studies on peace and conflict, and also some of the challenges with data use. Our presentation is going to focus on a different aspect of research, and that's really how you design research that's policy relevant, and then how you can increase the likelihood that that research is going to have traction amongst the audiences that you're trying to influence. So we're going to speak on this based on a collaboration that our two organizations undertook on impact evaluation in Somalia.
Thank you for having me. My name is Andy Blum. I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego. And I will say I had some small role in putting together the precursor of the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium. So it's kind of exciting. It's like visiting your kid after they graduate from college and seeing that they've gone on to great things. So thank you for having me, to Jessica. Can we get there, actually?
Yeah, thank you.
So policy relevant research, this isn't a new challenge. I think a lot of us understand what the challenge is. It's about getting someone to take a decision, either to keep doing something or stop doing something based on some research you've done. And just to situate what we're going to be talking about, it's really pretty early in the theory of change of this sort of policy relevant research happening. What we're talking about, what we want to talk about, is how you get decision makers to engage with your research. How do you get that sort of first step where they're willing to sort of take it and see what it might mean for them, while not dumbing down the research so much that you can't even call it research anymore. So that's the sort of challenge that we want to talk about. So I did this thing in San Diego where we were doing this event on campus, and it was a TED-style event, and I did like 10 sessions with the guy who does TEDx in San Diego. And he says, Ted, ideas to remember. What's the idea you want them to remember? That's where you have to start. So this is the idea we want you to remember. What this took was to have evidence, rigorous evidence that wasn't dumbed down, plus relationships with people who would engage with you on that evidence. And it was relevant for both some of the successes we had, but also some of the challenges or failures we had as well. And so we'll talk through a little bit about how we ended up thinking about what those relationships meant and how we leveraged them.
So we want to give you a little bit of background on the specific impact evaluation that we worked on, starting first with the motivations for doing this research. And the first motivation was because it was sort of clear to us that there are these big evidence gaps around the question of what works to reduce violence or to prevent young people from engaging in violence. And there are very few empirical studies really testing this and trying to measure it at the micro level. So at Mercy Corps, we started to build a research agenda on this topic, and that research agenda is not based on one study, but it's sort of trying to test theories that underlie a lot of youth development programs that are focused on reducing violence, and testing those theories across multiple contexts and over many years. And this study that we undertook in Somalia was one of those, was a piece of that research agenda. And it also built on previous research in Somalia that we had done, which includes a survey that we undertook in 2012 before we even designed the program. Another important motivation was accountability. As you can imagine, this program that we evaluated, it was a fairly large investment, a $40 million investment by the US government. So we felt an imperative to really understand what the impacts of the program was, or if there were no impacts. We felt like we had to really dig into that a bit. So the study that we designed was trying to respond to this question, which is basically, what is the impact of secondary education and civic engagement? This is what our program focused on young people's propensity towards violence in Puntland and South Central Somalia. And we were working in areas that had been previously under the control of Al-Shabaab. And so, as you can imagine, we face a lot of challenges designing an impact evaluation of this sort. The first was, of course, the challenge of accessibility. We were trying to go into very remote and highly insecure communities. And so this meant that we had to build in some flexibility in our research design. The second challenge was the fact that we were doing this impact evaluation ex post, which means we did not have a baseline survey, and we sort of did this evaluation after the program started. So that meant that we had to rely on matching techniques to be able to measure the impact. And the third challenge was the issue of social desirability bias, since we were measuring people's support for Al-Shabaab and for armed opposition groups. And as you can imagine, asking this in the context of South Central Somalia was very dangerous, and also meant that we were unlikely to get findings that were reliable. So we had to think through this, and we ended up using survey experiments to get around this issue. So the actual research design that we had was a quasi-experimental impact evaluation that was mixed methods, so quantitative and qualitative. We ended up doing 1,200 surveys of youth participants in 8 communities that we matched. So there were treatment communities and control communities that we matched based on factors to ensure that they were comparable. And then we compared youth who received education against those who received no intervention, and also those who received education plus civic engagement.
So I was a little bit more involved in the qualitative research, and I'm a big fan of mixed methods research, and in terms of what we did and some of the findings, I'm happy to talk about that with anyone who's interested. In terms of the topic we're talking about now, which is this engagement piece, I think there was 2 lessons we took away, one sort of positive and one more negative. The difficult thing is that you've got more complicated results, not just because it's qualitative and there's a little more nuance there to communicate anyway, but because you've got these 2 set of results, and how do you fit them together, into sort of coherent stories to tell about what your results mean. The positive thing was, I think it was a different door into the research for a lot of policymakers. There's quite a few policymakers that think in qualitative terms. They think in what's the story that's going on the ground here. And we got some very interesting stories, for instance, about the short-term dynamics. A school is an education institute, but it's a signaling mechanism to Al-Shabaab. And so the policymaker might be more interested in that kind of more visceral reality that was coming out in the qualitative research. So we do think it helped engagement in that way. So this is kind of the main thing we wanted to talk to you today in the brief sort of time we have. And it was the one thing we kind of hit on because we had this very nuanced and I think quite complicated set of results, both from the quantitative and the qualitative. And here were some of the complications or complexities of the results we had. And just to highlight one, this idea of education and what impact it has is actually quite complicated. It raises expectations, and if those aren't met, does that mean you're more violent? It might increase your hope for the future, so that could mean you're less, prone to support violence. And so, it wasn't a simple story to tell about the results. And so what we ended up doing was engaging a wide range of policymakers to help us make sense of these results during the research process. So instead of just handing them a report at the end, we said, here's our preliminary results, or here's what we've got right now. Help us make sense of it. What does it mean to you? What piece of this is interesting to you? And I think that engagement as part of the process really was something that worked well. And we saw it, go ahead and do the slide. We saw it as this hybrid process of sort of research and dissemination. It was important to get that research out there, to disseminate it, but we were also updating our results at the same time. And there was 3 processes. I mean, there was the internal process we did. We needed to make sense of it, and it was Mercy Corps and us and the field team, and then the people who are actually doing the research in Somalia. So there was a whole process internally. We did it with a Washington, D.C. group. And the challenge we had, we wanted to do this as well with our own global networks. So the Kroc Institute has a network, for instance, of 1,000 women peace leaders. And we wanted to send it out to them and say, you know, how does this resonate with you? What do you make of this? And that didn't work. We got this sort of tiny trickle of responses back. And it's because we didn't really build up the relationships. It would have been better to say at the beginning, here's 50 that we want to ask, bring them along, create the connections more strongly, and then we would have gotten better results, I think. So here's a couple of the examples of the types of folks we talked to. The research, it was interesting because a lot of people might be interested in this research. Peace builders, folks who work on CVE, people who work on education in crisis zones. And one of the things we struggled with is we went kind of broad and then realized we didn't go that deep. And there's this tension between dissemination and research here. And so I think in retrospect, we maybe wanted to pick one of these, like pick the education and crisis people, really map out who the 10 or 12 people in that specific field or subfield, and sort of hit them and make it go a little deeper into that community if you really want to see some influence. And I mean, if you can do it all, great, but it is a time-consuming process to go through these meetings. And so in retrospect, I think we should have been a little more strategic and maybe, you know, picked 2 of these instead of kind of getting it out there to a broad range of sectors.
So once we finished our analysis and sense-making, the final step was really dissemination, and there were two aspects of this. The first was internal dissemination. And the goal was to essentially ensure that this research fed back into the work that we were doing at Mercy Corps, and it helped to continue helping us build our strategy on this topic. We don't have much time to discuss this, and I feel like we could dedicate a full presentation to this alone. But we've recognized there are some key challenges as well as some best practices to internal dissemination, and these are just a few. Just to highlight a couple, I think internally we're realizing we need to sort of target the key influencers within the organization, the individuals who are most likely to spread the research findings broadly and help it incorporate it into broader agency initiatives and strategy. It's always best practice to go back and share findings locally and to engage with program staff that actually participated in the research and ensure that they're bought into the findings, and this is a good way of doing it. In terms of challenges, these are just a couple, but I think the biggest one is staff turnover. Whenever there's not continuity in the project staff, that really does make it difficult for the programs to incorporate the findings into their work. And then on the external dissemination front, we really invest a lot in this at Mercy Corps. It's a big part of the research process. And essentially, we bring together multiple teams to execute a dissemination plan. So we have a policy team, a media team, our research team, and each one of these teams are simultaneously trying to get the findings out through their different channels. So media team shares this with journalists, the policy team shares this with lawmakers and Congress, and the research team, we try to share this with research thought leaders, and we also, in some cases, try to publish these results in peer-reviewed journals. And the objectives of this dissemination is, of course, to circulate the findings, but also, importantly, to also build our credibility, because we really see research as a process and not just a single report. So an example of this is with this SYLI study. One interesting thing that we did is we ended up publishing an op-ed in the Monkey Cage, the Washington Post Monkey Cage, which is, if you don't know, it's a blog that is widely read amongst people who are interested in governance. And this really helped get our credibility because the research that is usually discussed on that blog is of high quality or very rigorous. So we're really proud of that.
So last slide, just some takeaways to wrap things up. You know, it really was, and thinking back to this idea of evidence plus relationships, it was really important that this was part of ongoing research. Mercy Corps and my organization, had engaged with these policymakers before on previous research iterations. So the question is, if you're not in that position, what do? You got to think intentionally about, can you plug into other processes, or can you get other partners that are going to help you sort of have those relationships? And then the one, like the sort of big takeaway was this kind of sense-making process that we engaged with the policymakers. And it helps with this central challenge of balancing clarity and simplicity and nuance, because they were co-creating the meaning of this. And they were helping us navigate them toward what was really important about the results. And so it was a way, not to obsess about the packaging, the one-page policy brief, that one paragraph for the busy policymaker. It was a way kind of around that challenge and maintaining some complexity, but then also communicating it to the policymakers. Mercy Corps is a big organization, and if they can change some practice inside their organization, that might have a lot of impact. And it has impact in their organization, but it also has impact the next time they submit a proposal to a funder. The funder is going to look and say, oh, they're citing that research, they're changing what they're doing. So that matters in kind of a cycle of creating change. And the formal dissemination strategies, I really think Beza is right. I mean, there is this sense, sure, it's important to get those final results out there, but be intentional that you're setting yourself up for the next iteration of research, because the final report might not be exactly what people pay attention to, but you're establishing yourself as a credible voice in the field through some of these other channels, and that pays off kind of in the next iteration of research. So thanks, that's it.
Thank you all so much. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I'd like to open it up to Q&As for any of our panelists. If you have a generic question you would like posed to a specific panelist or one across the board, please let us know. But we'll be coming around with a mic here to help you out. Looks like we have one right here. She's bringing you a mic, yeah? Oh, sorry, we'll come back.
No, I think somebody was ahead of me, but all right. Hi, my name is Megan Price. I work as the head of office for the Knowledge Platform Security and Rule of Law. My question actually goes to Beza and Andy directly, although I really, really appreciated all the presentations. You guys did an excellent job, all of you. We, at the Knowledge Platform, we sit exactly where you guys were speaking to, this idea of how do you make the research that's coming out of our community relevant for policymakers and try and make an impact at that more kind of generative level. But one thing that we run into a lot when we are really encouraging our researchers to engage with policymakers is their, almost knee-jerk fear to policy-based research, and to the idea that if we open up our findings to policymakers too soon and too early, they're going to try to manipulate our findings to fit their predetermined policy. And it's a bias, it's a concern, sometimes it's a valid concern, but I'm wondering if there were processes that really helped you guys in maybe helping protect the findings that you were generating from that kind of maybe perhaps manipulation from the other side. And I don't mean to sound kind of alarmist, but it's something that we struggle with our research community to convince them of.
I think it's a great question. And I would say a couple things to that. I mean, one, again, to come back to the point, the relationships matter. And so a relationship is based on trust. And so it may be that, you want to go to folks that you do have a relationship with. And if not, you want to be more clear about the fact that, you don't get to tell us what we publish, do those kinds of things. I mean, the other thing that I didn't talk about that could just for time's sake that I think is really important is we tend to think in terms of researchers and policymakers and forget the kind of interlocutors. There's a whole industry in DC of sort of policy translators, and it's really probably more those folks that we're talking about here, the folks that do have time to sit down with you. We sat down with someone from the Atlantic, when we did talk to policymakers, but we sat down with someone from USIP, from the Atlantic Council, and it's their kind of job to take what you're doing, and then do that translation to policymakers, or maybe when they go back and become a policymaker. And I think there's more of an opportunity there to trust that they're not going to run with that and sort of take it off with a bias. I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet, is who your researchers are matter. I mean, there has to be some comfort level with the fact that you want to share work in progress, that you get what applied research is. I mean, there are pure academic researchers, and they might just not be right for this kind of initiative.
Thank you very much. Hisham Jabi at MSI Tetratic. In terms of the management side of the research and who's going to utilize the outcome, it sounds to me that the audience or the beneficiaries, either CVE community or research or local even government, determine the framing questions. And I look at the framing question a little bit quickly, tons of elements, and you probably need to really adjust it in a way that makes sense and create that proxy elements and components that suit certain audience from management perspective. How did you handle that complexity?
I think, you can talk about that, but I was just going to say, I think we really, I guess, in the design phase, we think about who we're trying to influence, who the key audiences are that we're trying to engage with, and what is the broader policy question or issue, because oftentimes we have a very specific research question, but it speaks to a much broader policy challenge. So we first identify all of those things, and then we design with the intention of having that kind of influence and that kind of impact at the end. What was unique about this project, which I hope we do in other instances, is we engage those audiences that we wanted to influence in the process, so that we sort of got their input as we were doing the analysis and as we were interpreting the results. And again, that in this case made it much more likely that they use the results because their input fed into it as well. But you wanted to add? No.
I'll just add, maybe answering a different question, but we didn't get to talk about it in the slide deck, so now we can come back to it. And that's that we are doing research not just on the policy side and not just on that knowledge creation side, but also just on the decision-making side at the program or project level, where we aren't looking for external validity across contexts. We're wanting to know what's the best way to run this program today in this context. And at Mercy Corps, we worked on a non-conflict program, but after Typhoon Haiyan, we did an impact evaluation where we were randomizing just the way we delivered the product. This was a blanket cash program, and do we give it in lump sum, or do we give the same amount but over 3 or 4 tranches? And that sort of operational or optimization research has a different set of stakeholders. Your stakeholder is the program team and your direct beneficiaries.
Looks like we have a question here at the end.
I can probably speak up. You guys can hear me in the back. I have a quick question for you guys. When it comes to research and especially your dissemination plan, what indicators did you track to tell you whether or not that dissemination plan actually gave you the credibility that you think it did? And if you didn't, could you kind of give us some thoughts about what you wish you would have tracked in order to validate that plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to measure credibility, like monitor it and measure it in a dissemination plan, but we do monitor things like who does our report reach. So we have a database of people that we sent to, and we look at it like how many people has this report reached. We also have metrics on the number of downloads from our website, and we have a policy team that basically does an analysis of I would say the output of the dissemination, not necessarily the impact, but how far and wide the report has been shared. I think more qualitatively, we know that our research is building our credibility because people tell us that, or people will come and cite our research or tell us that this work was really influential in the development of a new strategy at USAID. Or I think it's more of a qualitative understanding that we're doing good research and that's being influential amongst the audiences that we're trying to influence.
I mean, we do have, like any good agency, metrics that we don't follow up on. So I think in our policy and research influence, we look at invites to different fora, mentions in strategy policy documents. But again, it's we don't have a systematic way of getting a sample of bellwether thought leaders and coming back with them and tracking. But I know good think tanks do that or should be doing that. We're not quite set up that way yet.
Other questions? It's like right behind Carlotta.
Yeah, definitely. So I have a question for David, but then it's probably a question also for you, Paul. Carlotta from Social Coming Out, sorry. So I guess the first... yes. Okay, sorry, yeah. So the first question is about, as you were talking about that before, there is a lot of data out there. And there's a big questions about how much you can compare those data and how much trust you can put on those data. And then on the other side, there is also a lot of research fatigue from community, especially in certain countries, such as DRC, South Sudan, Nigeria, where people have run research for decades. And they always go to the same community, different program, because as someone was mentioning, every program has its own baseline, and then maybe academics are developing their PhD research, and so these people have been exposed. They're exposed over and over to surveys and other type of data collection. So my questions for you and for everyone else is, first, how do we balance? Because when we talk about code of conduct, I think that's also something that it's our responsibilities as researcher, as peace builder, and as practitioners. So how do we balance this, the fact that there is so much data and so much research that is already there, and having rigorous data for our new programming? And then the second question is how, because at Search, we have worked a lot trying to bridge this gap between academics and practitioners, and trying to make them communicating and sharing data and sharing what they do so that it doesn't duplicate. So how do we foster that? And especially South-to-South relations, so academics from the South and not like Western academics only. How do we make these two communicating?
Okay, well, thanks very much. So I think there's a couple of factors there. I mean, how do we make use of existing research, I think was tackled well by Jack with the sharing platform. So I think in order to do that, it's more instilling a culture of sharing information in a perhaps more timely manner than journal articles or annual reports or things like that. So I mean, I liked the sound of that. I'll check that out. The other sort of issue on fatigue and how that should come into effect. I mean, I think the way I described this on Monday. So again, apologies for anyone that's heard this. Is mathematicians and statisticians, are really used to being ignored because most people just ignore them. But now in the data, the data revolution, they suddenly have a voice and an audience, and more people are engaging with them. Now, because it's always been a sort of very technical field, the broader social implications of what they do is only really briefly touched upon. I mean, in my degree, it was all about techniques and methods, and no social responsibility, no education on where these things fit and how they get used, and the policy implications and the social implications of any one particular study, either being on the society or on the participants of that study. There is a little bit of it, and there are code of ethics for statisticians, but they're all about what type of average do you use when the numbers are like this. They're not about, if you use this, then you could influence the military budget for the next 10 years. So I think there's just a little bit of more of a widening of the quantitative field of their place in society as data becomes more and more prominent. And then also the other thing that I actually do work on is working with non-technical people and saying, if you want to critique data, here's how you do it. Here's how you think about it, and trying to distill the myth that it's over and above any one particular person. Because especially in a lot of the data here, the indicators have to be simple, otherwise they're not useful. And so if there's an indicator that doesn't make sense to any one particular person, regardless of their background, it's not a good indicator. And I'd really encourage people who maybe have a maths phobia to not be worried about asking and pushing back if something doesn't make sense.
I mean, the question of fatigue is hard, and the question of how do you get more South-South or Southern researchers leading these programs is an even tougher question, and I do have some experience with that. And we could talk about that for a long time, but the one thing I would flag is that I think some of the methodological arms races we've seen in the field are both harmful to those issues. So if you need a perfectly methodologically rigorous study, you're going to go to where that's possible, and you're going to use researchers that have the best training in the world. And so I think that's not it's not a bad thing to have those studies, but if we open our aperture and understand what slightly less rigorous studies can tell us, then we open space to do researcher in harder places with folks that might have a lot to say but don't have necessarily the same level of training as a Harvard-based researcher.
I think we have time for one more question. Zach, you threw your hand up first. Hold on, grab the mic, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your presentations. Zach Tilton with the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University. My question is for all of you who are involved in the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium. To the aims of developing methodological rigor, improving culture evaluation, and promoting evidence-based practice and policy, what evidence does the PEC have towards those outcomes? What are you looking at?
I like how Jack's pointing at me. I think you're first, yeah. So I am happy to say that we do actually have a nicely rigorous log frame that we put together. But one of the things that I think we're really focused on, both measuring as well as creating space, is for primarily a lot of conversations like these. How do we create an environment where individuals, practitioners, researchers, academics, et cetera, can come together and explore these issues? Obviously, I think that that's not always easy to measure in an outcome-based process. There's very output-oriented, how many times did we meet, how many people attended, et cetera. But we're looking both in terms of increasing capacity. How do we see a change or transition in individual organizations, both from grassroots up to larger? That includes our work with Mercy Corps as a partner, as well as Search for Common Ground, and then Isabella and I within our organizations and networks, as well as then trying to better track, are we providing what individuals need? So we do a lot more qualitative assessments on both our resources and tools. That includes, as Isabella's talking about, when we're putting together training materials and the guiding steps. I know Mercy Corps as well is going through with the cross-implementation, cross-programming, exploration, and learning, is really, to borrow a phrase from CDA, making sure that we're taking time to listen. And we're piloting those, and we're working with diverse groups to know, is this answering a question that you're asking, or addressing a need that you actually need some assistance in? So I would be happy, Zach, to show you some of our more direct measures, but definitely looking at more changing the culture, which is a lot harder to measure, but both through our concrete activities as well as then shifts within the space on how we talk about issues. I mean, I can tell you just personally, at the PEC Forum last year, I felt like so much was talked about the ongoing problems, the ongoing debates, and we weren't really forward focused. And I see such a huge shift this year for anyone who was in the audience last year that, I mean, this is personally, I joined last year, 3 weeks or so before the conference. But I really see a massive shift that we're looking at how do we adapt and make changes and really look to the future. At the forum, Keith and John both commented on how an RCT is not the best fit for every program, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aiming for more rigorous approaches, and it's better to aim high and fall back some than to start low and try and build up. And I personally, in a qualitative, purely anecdotal assessment, have seen a huge shift on the way that we talk about these issues in the field just in the last year, and I find that very encouraging. I'm going to pass it to my other colleagues if they have any other comments.
Maybe just briefly, and then I'll pass to you. It's a great question. I will only add to what Jessica already said. We are tracking increased interest in organizations wanting to apply the more generic tools to their specific institutional and programmatic challenges. So that's a little easier for us to do at CDA because we are quite often invited to the inner kitchens of these organizations to advise them on short-term or long-term basis, to accompany them. And that's where I find the most opportunity to really test the resources we've already created in the previous years of PEC and to see the uptake and adaptation that is necessary. And we're tracking as well external, events where we're invited to share the findings, and it's been definitely another important for where our resources are being both, tested conceptually, but also challenged in some ways, and some new thinking is being inserted as we present them. So I just did that at the European Evaluation Society conference a few weeks ago, and previously at State Department and so on, and with the stabilization unit in the UK, where specific PEC resources were most useful for them. But I think the biggest story is also with the user engagement on DM&E for Peace, so I'll let Jack talk about that.
Yeah, so I have a couple of sort of interesting sort of insights on just the culture of evaluation and promoting evaluation within organizations. And this comes from someone who at the last 2 American Evaluation Association conferences has hosted a War of the World session on evaluators versus everyone else. And what we've seen at Search more generally is that when you strip down evaluation, like I said, down to its bare bones, and you look at what works, what didn't, and why, you find that program staff and other partners are much more willing to engage in the evaluation process. I think on how we can create that culture more widely, I think, yes, sharing resources and sharing materials is a great first step. But I think looking at what the PC has created, looking at all the events we host, it's essentially how do we turn all of these materials into an actual evidence base. I still think as the field becomes increasingly professionalized, we don't understand what works and what doesn't. And a lot of programs across many NGOs are built off one-off successes. And I think our next step is getting a better understanding of that, of what effectiveness looks like, developing that evidence base and using it to actually drive our decisions moving forward.
Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.
I want to introduce myself. I'm April. I did the DM&E for Peace webinar for JPAL.
Yeah, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Not too bad.
Yeah.
Very, very warm, but very, very warm, but very, very warm, but very, very warm, but very, very warm, but